Yeah, welcome to the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. The Legendino is in balmy Rio, and I didn't have to think long about putting the couplet together, whereas I'm in freezing London. Yeah, that didn't quite work, did it? Tim, good to see you.
Yeah, get back under that duvet. Why don't you?
Hang on, where's my hot water bottle? That's a good point you make. No, genuinely, I'm not laughing there. It is so freezing. You are lucky. I bet sometimes when you're sitting there in Rio and you're seeing the weather forecast over here, you've got a big Cheshire cat-sized grin on your
Yeah,
face.
yeah, I do, and I do appreciate it. Even though I'm
Uh,
surrounded by an entire nation moaning about the heat.
yeah,
Extraordinary. What's the
I know.
matter with you?
I will never ever moan about the heat. I don't care. My neighbour, he's from Ireland and he's ginger haired as well. So he claims that's the reason why I never see him in the summer. I said, you know why you don't see me in the winter? Yeah. Look at my face. I was made in the shade. And I feel when people complain about the summer, I genuinely feel as if I need to give them a slap because they're going to jinx it for us, and the winter's going to be cold just to pay us back. Anyway, that aside, we have gathered today to pay tribute to one of the footballing greats, iconic great. Obviously, the people in Germany are probably feeling the loss of Franz Beckenbauer, German national captain and manager, coach at one point, but a World Cup winner, both as a player and as a coach. They're probably feeling it. Maybe not to the same, but to a similar extent as Brazilians were feeling the loss of Mario Zagallo the other day.
Yeah, and look when he was born, Franz Beckenbauer.
Yeah, shocking. I couldn't believe that.
September of 1945.
Mm, mm,
Now, you imagine the country that he was born into.
mm, mm,
I saw this film a few years ago. It was from 48. It was Merle Oberon film called Berlin Express.
mm,
And it really hit home because it was filmed there in Germany. And the place is just rubble. There is
mm,
nothing else, just rubble,
mm,
like Gaza is at the moment. And, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, yeah, but I know what's going to happen. They don't. The people living in Germany, they don't know that, 20 years ahead, they're going to be living through this boom and this miracle. So Beckenbauer is born into rubble. And I think that's important. And it's important, I think, to the team that we're paying tribute to today. The match that we're going back to is the final of the Euros, as it then was. It was the 18th of June, 1972. And it's when I think that Beckenbauer West Germany team hit their absolute peak. I think they peaked a couple of years before the World Cup, which they also won in 1974. And if you look at that Germany team, look at their appearance, it's almost like it's a mass Charlie Georgeification of the team. There's long hair and there's
I knew you.
sideburns
I
and
knew
and
exactly
and
what you meant. Don't worry.
there's a little bit less about that at Beckenbauer.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
but what this German team is I think a team of a country which has rebuilt itself, and it's a team of people who are open to new ideas. And I think
mm.
the physical way that this
Oh,
team appear, because it's nothing like the that awful stereotype of the Germans, that we kind of grew up with, Actung robots. There's nothing like that at all. And Beckenbauer, Der Kaiser, and all of that. There's the air of arrogance around him. I often think arrogance is a positive thing, not necessarily
mm,
a negative thing. I like a
mm,
little bit of
mm,
arrogance. You haven't got a
mm,
little bit of arrogance, you're going to get walked all over. So that there's that arrogance that maybe people associate rightly or wrongly with the Germans. But there's a lovely mental flexibility about the way that he plays and around the way that the team plays. So I find them a very, very interesting West German team, exactly because they so successfully break away from those stereotypes of what we think of as the Germans.
Well, I can tell you, I saw Charlie George in the flesh when I was probably 12 or 13 years old. And when I say in the flesh, I'm talking about close up, toe to
In the
toe.
hair more than the flesh, probably.
Yeah, he was in his pomp, hair wise and sideburns wise. I remember him as a very genial fellow because one of the Arsenal players, it might even have been Charlie George himself, his brother had a motorcycle mechanic garage up the road from my school. My school was on a hill in those days. My secondary school was on a hill. And at the top of the hill, there was this car mechanic. So when we were coming home from school and taking a shortcut, you had to take the shortcut through a place called Chettle Court, I remember. As we were coming up the hill, we'd see Arsenal players. We'd see the Arsenal first team,
I
one or two
sympathise.
people, yeah, taking in their E-type Jags or their
Mm.
Lamborghini. No, did they have Lamborghinis? Probably Jensen Interceptors, I think,
Mm.
in those days. And Charlie George was there. And I tell you, it doesn't matter where you come from in London or in Britain in those days. When you see even the enemy right up
Mm-hmm.
close, you have a not even grudging
Mm-hmm.
respect, but a real respect because in those days we knew who the great footballers were. We saw them on
But
TV.
you don't you associate Charlie George with a sense of individualistic expression.
Yes, yes.
You don't really associate him with ideas. You don't really see him as an ideas man.
Was that
But this,
important
well,
in those
this
days?
this German side, they have the individualistic expression,
Mm,
the individualist kind of rebelliousness, but they also have ideas. Maybe this is that part of that earnestness with which the Germans approach so many things, and Beckenbauer exemplifies this because Beckenbauer is a hugely talented midfielder, really, really talented midfielder, capable of wonderful things in the final third of the field. But he looks at the way that the game is developing and he sees that space is being eaten up in the middle of the field. So what can he do? Where can he bring his talent to bear on the game? And he ends up going back. So he becomes the sweeper, sometimes behind the defensive line, plugging the holes. But the idea of the position is if he goes back, he's then got space to bring the ball forward. And it's a revolutionary conception. The sweeper as attacker. It's a revolutionary idea, and it was one that the certainly the English press at the time really didn't understand. Didn't understand what. And when his time at Bayern Munich was up, and he went to the States, he played for New York Cosmos. They didn't understand it either. When they saw
mm,
him at the back, they're saying, "Hey, we spent all that money on it." No, so he wasn't allowed to do that in the States. When he was playing for Cosmos, he had to play closer to the opposing goal. But it is an idea of starting the play from the back where there's space and then bringing it forward and working the 1-2s. It's an idea that with this German side works wonderfully well. And the game that I think is next one to have a look at, this final of the Euros against the Soviet Union. They've
mm,
beaten England in the quarterfinals over 2 legs. And then you got the semi-finals and the final is the kind of tournament part in Belgium. And they beat Belgium, the hosts. And then this final against the Soviet Union. The first goal, if you see some of the highlight clips, you don't really appreciate it because it cuts it too early. But the first goal all starts with him bringing the ball out defence, pass to, and he gives it to Netzer. Gunter Netzer was another one with the flowing hair. He's
mm.
another one. Netzer, Beckenbauer has created space for Netzer. Netzer shoots back off the crossbar, comes back. Heinkies, who's playing kind of from the right wing, shoots. The goalkeeper pushes it out, and there, surprise, surprise, is Gerd Müller to tap it in 1-0, the Germans, and they're on the way to a comfortable win. But the whole thing starts with Beckenbauer bringing the ball out the back, giving rhythm to the team, out of the back. And this is the game, I think, where with a title at stake, everything works for the Germans. Remember, the Germans won the World Cup in 54, a shock result against Hungary. They haven't won anything else. So this victory is the one that sets them up for winning the World Cup, even winning the World Cup again in 1990 when Beckenbauer is the manager. So this one, 72, is, I think, the golden age of the German national team, when they're a wonderful, wonderful team to watch. And it all starts with Beckenbauer aristocratically bringing the ball out of defence.
You started this conversation off by talking about the history of when Beckenbauer was born at the end of the World War, Second World War. Of course, here they're playing the Soviet Union, who played a crucial part in bringing Germany to its knees during the Second World War. And this is a point where Germany and the Soviet Union are at the heart of what we call the Cold War, because Germany as a country is at the coalface of that Cold War, divided in two, as we know. East Germany being a Soviet stronghold, and West Germany being, what we would call the Allies, the good guys, or the cowboys in white hats that came to save Germany at the last minute. So, and the dividing line between them is the Berlin Wall, obviously, where you then see that, this match will have a sort of a resonance, perhaps on both sides of the Berlin Wall, with Germans on both sides of the Berlin Wall rooting for West Germany, maybe, rather than the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union are no slouches. They're the ones who've, they're the favourites in this match, aren't they? I would have thought.
Well, it's probably equals and equals. I mean, the Soviets, the Germans obviously had reached the final of the World Cup in 66. The Soviets had reached the semi-final. The Germans had reached the semi-final of the World Cup in 70. The Soviets had reached the quarter-final. So the Germans, I think, are a little bit ahead. But the Soviets are certainly seen as a strong team. And they have their chances. But they are thoroughly outclassed by a German side, which, as I say, I think hit its peak. I think they were better here than they were when they won the World Cup 2 years later on home ground.
And arguably, the Soviet Union had arguably a smoother progress to the final of this UEFA Euros Championship than Germany, that had to face some tough opposition. You mentioned England along the way. Now, remember, this is England sort of 6 years after beating Germany in the World Cup final as well. There must have been a sense of what the Germans call Schadenfreude, well, we all do now, don't we, about that victory against England.
Yeah, well, it was the first one. They hadn't beaten England at all till 68 in a friendly. And then they do it in the World Cup in 70, coming back from 2-0 down. They really shouldn't have won that game, but they did. No Gordon Banks and so on, but they did. This is the first time when they beat England. They not only beat England, they outclass England. This is the one that sets off, because going into that game in 72, England were favourites. Germany are still seen as behind England. That has never been the case since. Although I think we're leveling it up in the last few years, but that sets Germany on that run. Maybe I think they suffered from that for a while, because this way of playing, it was a sweeper behind three defenders, three midfielders, and like vaguely two wingers and a striker. It became absolutely set in stone. And this is so often the case in life, isn't it? Something which starts off as revolutionary becomes set in stone, and you lose the dynamism of the thing. I think Germany went through some of that as well, because the sweeper kind of behind the line, in the end, I think England buried that when we beat them 5-1 in 2001. Because if that sweeper doesn't position himself right, he just plays everyone onside. And also, there aren't that many players with the ability of Beckenbauer to bring the ball out of defence in that way. And of the ones who did it, I didn't think Lothar Matthäus did it particularly well. I think he was better when he operated in midfield. They had, in the mid-90s, they had Matthäus Sammer, who I think was fantastic at it, but he ran into injuries. I don't really think they ever had anyone who would play that role as well as Beckenbauer did, but they kept on trying to find someone to play that role. So their thinking, which in 72 is so flexible, then I think later on, because they just slavishly try and copy that model, becomes less so. But the flexibility of this side, I think, is terrific. I mean, nominally, Beckenbauer is behind three defenders. One of them, Schwarzenbeck, is a centre back, and he's the out and out defender. Another one, Hodges, he's Mr. Hodges, he's more defensive. But the other one is Breitner. Now, Breitner pops up all over the place.
Yeah.
And again, the flexibility of the thinking, and Breitner, don't mention this to him. I mentioned it to him once. I think I got away with it. He's very, very touchy about it. Paul, mate, you were like into Chairman Mao, weren't you? Everyone does stupid things when they're young. Oh, yeah. All right, mate. All right. Yeah. But again, that, can you imagine the England left back at the England left back at the time was Emlyn Hughes. Can you imagine Emlyn Hughes being into Chairman Mao? It's not very likely, is it? So
the Beatles, of course, mentioned Chairman Mao.
Lennon had a flirtation with Chairman Mao.
Do you know, it's one of the jeopardies of football that when you come up with innovation, it doesn't. The players have to fit that innovation, like how you describe this sweeper role. And I'm picturing it now because obviously we can sort of look at it with hindsight a little bit and think, wow, that was like and I promise you, I'm not making any sort of stereotypical German analogies there, but you can see that as a sort of a pincer movement. You've got your four lines of defense, and then you've got one sweeper behind that who picks up all the loose pieces and ensures that, the goalkeeper's protected and manages to move it forward. You have to, I imagine, play quite a high line in that form of...
Yeah, they didn't do it as high as the Dutch, who were going down a similar route at the same time. The Dutch played real press. Germany defended deeper. I asked Breitner about this when he'd forgiven me for mentioning Chairman Mao. And he said, yeah, we looked at the Dutch and we thought that's just too risky. And he said, you got to remember our mentality. All we want to win. And it's just drummed into you, win. So we thought the high line, it might have been aesthetically beautiful, but it was too risky, so we didn't do it. But there was something that Breitner told me, which I think is really relevant to this story, because Beckenbauer is also totally associated with Bayern Munich, who are now one of the giants of European football. They weren't. When the German National League, the Bundesliga, doesn't start till 1963. And it starts with the idea of you can only have one club per city. And Bayern aren't in it. It's 1860 Munich who are in it. And they're a bigger club, more traditional than Bayern. But Beckenbauer ends up at Bayern, and he's part of this group with Gerd Müller and the goalkeeper with those huge gloves, Sepp Maier, that come up together and get promoted. And the first time that they win the German league, I think they win the Cup Winners' Cup in 1967. And then they win the German league 1968, 1969. And then Breitner told me this. He said, the whole history is dependent on Munich getting the 72 Olympics because we got a new stadium. They don't use it anymore. They've got their own stadium. But the Olympic Stadium was built. And suddenly that increased the capacity threefold. And this is a time before TV money, before big sponsorship money. Your revenue was basically coming from the ticket money. And now, where you only had 20,000, now you got 60,000 plus. And Breitner said that us having that stadium at that time, just when we had this team coming together, that's what enabled us. And then, Bayern win the European Cup in 74, in 75 and 76. And then they're absolute giants. And, Beckenbauer is the heart of that team. But who knows? If it wasn't for Munich getting the Olympics and having the new stadium, he might have been sold somewhere else.
Yeah, and just to put that into context, the attendance at the final, this final that we're talking about, West Germany versus Soviet Union, which was at the High School Stadium in Belgium, there was 43,000 there. So the idea that you could be in a stadium with 60,000 as your club team is just phenomenal. But let's not forget the Soviet Union are in it as well, and they've got a decent goalkeeper, haven't they? The Germans have got to get past Yev Rudakov, and he is there doing the Lev Yashin role. And what saves he keeps the Soviet Union. I keep meaning to sort of say Russia, but no, the Soviet Union. He keeps the Soviet Union in the game, certainly in the first half of the
Yeah, he
game,
does. He makes some terrific saves. And
because Germany
the one who
chances.
at the other end, who causes most problems to the German goal, to Sepp Maier, is called Troshkin. Wow, that's not that far away from Trotsky. He must have had a hard time in the Soviet Union, that lad. So all credit to him for coming through that one and still troubling Germany on the field.
And of course, the Stranglers mentioned Trotsky. Beatles mentioned Mao. Stranglers mentioned Trotsky. Where will it all end? You could ask.
Around this time, mid 70s, two Dutch. I remember reading this in Shoot magazine when I was a kid. Two Dutch people got in a huge fight in a bar, and it ended up in court. And what the court had to decide was whether one Dutchman calling another Dutchman "you dirty Beckenbauer" was sufficient justification for violent retaliation.
I'm glad you read it in Shoot magazine. Font of all wisdom, knowledge. Where would we have been without it? So the Germans go 1-0 up. Well, they're going to go 2-0 up, and they're going to go 3-0 up as well. But let's start with the 1-0 up. Gerd Müller, like you say, gets a fortuitous goal to rebound.
Yeah, it's a rebound off the keeper, but that's the centre forward's art, isn't it? And as we're saying, the whole move is set up because you get your rhythm from the back. And it's Beckenbauer from the back, setting up the rhythm. Netzer shoots off the bar. Heinke's shot pushed out by Rudakov, and there is Muller. He didn't get many from distance, I don't think.
No,
but he was.
But he did have. He did have no. I have a memory of him getting one certainly outside the box, and he had a powerful shot because he had those huge thighs for somebody who had a certain center of gravity about him. Low center of gravity, that is, but he had the Bobby Charlton thighs, I thought, and yes. I just when you're a kid, you always remember the shots that make the back of the net sort of like dance a jig, and it was one of those. And you thought,
isn't it great when you first play with proper nets? It's not jumpers. And you score a goal and you see the net bulge. It's one of the great moments, isn't it, when you're a kid?
One of the worst things, never mind the jumpers, when you had the post but no net at school, because they're not going to risk the nets for your youngsters. You had a post, you managed to get a goal. It wasn't often for me, but nevertheless, you expected to have some kind of like conclusion to your goal, whereas your ball just rolls off along the field behind you or so. But Germans make relatively quick work of this, don't they, this match?
Yeah, they do, yes. And Uli Hoeneß plays. And Uli Hoeneß, at this point, he's still an amateur. And do you know why he's an amateur? Because he wants to play in the Olympic Games later on that year. So he doesn't turn pro. That. Yeah, that's right. He chose it. So he doesn't turn pro until after the Olympic Games. He's one of those who's gone into obviously football administration afterwards. The unsung hero of the side is Wimmer, who covers every blade, and it's Wimmer who allows them to get away with having Netzer. Netzer is the Charlie George, the lank hair, the most creative in the team, but not always that interested in putting a shift in, and both for club and for country, because they played for Borussia Mönchengladbach. Wimmer is the runner, and it's lovely to see Wimmer have his moment of glory. Because 1-0 can always be overturned, but 2-0, that's a long way back for the Soviets, and it's Wimmer who gets the second. Lovely little slip ball through him, and in perpetual motion as ever, running beyond the Soviet defense and scoring with a left-footed cross shot.
We always see it in football as well, that we see a generational domination by one nation or another. And this, as you've alluded to, is the beginning of a good couple of years, or maybe longer than that. Arguably, this is part of the German Revolution over a period of a decade and a half or so, where they dominate football. And they, and I think Franz Beckenbauer is a part of this. They managed to instill the, it's not fear of Germany so much, but the belief that the Germans will always come through in the
Yeah,
end
yeah,
somehow. This is the beginning of that. I mean,
yeah. I
when
think it is. I think
England,
it is.
yeah, England play West Germany in 1966, as we know, at Wembley, and beat them in the final of that. And at that point, England had the belief that, well,
Even with the Germans equalising in the last minute of normal time and forcing
yeah,
extra time, I think
yeah.
you still believe that England were going to come through.
Mm. Uh,
Subsequently, you always thought it was going to be the Germans who were going to win in the end.
Crucially, we got a good view of them in 1972 because, yeah, in the lead up to this final, they play England, as we've said already. They play England at Wembley.
It's the
The scene.
first. It was the first England game I ever watched, um, and I remember watching this game as well against the Soviet Union, and I can still remember just it was so characteristic of when Germany played. You know those klaxons going off.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh,
That was the soundtrack to
yeah,
Germany then. You know all those
yeah,
klaxons.
yeah,
You
yeah.
knew it was Germany without having to watch having to see what the shirts were. Just the noise that the crowd made with those klaxons told you
Mm,
this was Germany.
yeah. 96,000 in at Wembley. 96,000. uh, which suggests that the England Germany rivalry was a thing.
Yeah,
96,000 people. Arguably, the emergence of Germany during these Euros saw the end of the England momentum
that's
as
it.
well.
That game is the moment that the baton changes hands.
Yeah, and Beckenbauer is
Yeah,
central to that as well, is he?
yeah. Important, I think, that Bobby Charlton has gone because prior to that, both in '66 and '70, they're having one-on-one duels. In the '66 final, both of them are sent out with instructions to mark the other. Alf Ramsey looked at the German side and he said, "There's only one who can beat us. It's Beckenbauer." So he says to Charlton, "You get on him." And Helmut Schön, the German coach, looks at the England side and said, "Well, there's no doubt who the star turn is. Franz, get a grip on him." And so both of them have their own little private duel. There are a few moments when Charlton does manage to get free. And Charlton, I think, is more influential in the game than Beckenbauer. It's one of the reasons that England win the game, and I think would have won the game even without that dodgy, controversial third goal. 4 years later in Mexico, Bobby Charlton's last game for England, and it's a key moment when Ramsey takes him off, substitutes him. It's the first World Cup where you can have substitutes. And he takes Bobby Charlton up. England are 2-0 up. And Ramsey's thinking, there's no way. England, my England side do not throw away 2-0 leads. The Germans haven't threatened. We're all right here. Charlton is 32. This is punishing conditions in the Mexican summer. We'll take him off and we'll keep him fresh for the semi. And it turned out to be a huge mistake because it frees Beckenbauer. And the first goal of that German comeback is, and Alan Mullery's a little bit at fault. Peter Bonetti's a lot at fault. But it's Beckenbauer now without Bobby Charlton, free to use his talents more creatively. And he goes right on Alan Mullery and scores with a shot that kind of bobbles under Peter Bonetti. And in '72, obviously, there's no Bobby Charlton anymore. And there's no doubt it's the kings of the midfield are Beckenbauer from deep and Netzer higher up. And Netzer has the freedom of the pitch. And England don't have the talent that can get a grip on these players. So that Bobby Charlton Franz Beckenbauer duel is absolutely fascinating. But Beckenbauer's the younger man, so
Well, yeah,
in the end, it goes to him.
he's a younger man. In 1966, he was the youngest player on the field. He's 20 years old.
It's
I mean,
extraordinary, isn't
it
it?
is shocking. I mean, it's when you think that my memory of '66, the only Germans I remember from '66 are Beckenbauer and Muller, given, I was 6 years
Yeah,
old,
Muller didn't
whatever.
play 60. He's too young for 66. He comes
Oh,
along
so why would
later.
I have remembered him? Anyway, it doesn't, it's not relevant. The idea that a 20-year-old was the German defensive,
Well, he was midfield then. He was a creative midfielder in 66. So he was the linchpin
of
of the
course.
side. This is
Yeah.
before he goes back as a sweeper. So that they recognized in him something very, very special, very, very early on.
But he was a defensive midfielder. Okay. Um, so going back to 1972, then how does this German side then extrapolate what they've achieved at Heysel Stadium against the Soviet Union, winning the Euros in '72? How do they then extrapolate that to becoming World Cup winners 2 years later?
Well, they're
Obviously,
at
they're going to
home.
have, yeah, they've got a
Yeah.
home advantage. Yeah.
So this is the last really serious competitive game they've got until the World Cup, and that's difficult for them, I think. And in those 2 years, they lose Netz. And Netzer had missed the '70 World Cup through injury, and he plays '74, but he's nowhere near as good. He doesn't play all of the games, and because they haven't had hard competitive games in the 2 years, they kind of have to feel their way through the tournament a little bit. The Germans, they're not firing on all cylinders. They lose to East Germany in the group phase, so their route to the final is not as impressive as that of Holland, who they play in the final, and they go 1-0 down in the first minute. And so Holland are everyone's favourites, both mathematically and artistically. I always thought that Holland scored too early, and Holland, there were perhaps 1-0 up, were more interested in taking a piss because it meant a lot to them. Again, the war, and what happened to Holland in the war shaped for a while, I think, that whole Germany-Holland rivalry. But as Paul Breitner told me, they 1-0 down in the first minute. No worries. No worries. They'll win. We're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to win. And Gerd Muller, they came through in the end. And again, that was my first World Cup I watched at the age I was just turned 9. And I can close my eyes and I can see Beckenbauer striding forward, erect posture, as if he's playing in a suit. Really.
Yeah.
And
jacket, I like to think.
Yeah, and distributing the play and so on. He was, so for my generation, he was one of the first non-British players who really made an impact, because we were seeing him. We were able to see him in these games in '72, in the World Cup in '74, and you just knew where he was on the field. And there are a couple of times in this game against the Soviet Union. Now, Germany go 1-0 up. They want to win. So he doesn't have to expose himself that much. But you can see sometimes when he just aristocratically comes away and ends a Russian move, and him just taking the ball off the toes of an attacker. It reminds me then of an old-fashioned school teacher gently correcting a slow student.
Yeah. In geography.
Yes.
I can see it.
The ball's round and I have it and it's here.
And
this
that was
is the
me.
position of the ball.
I was the student, mate. Did you not know that? When you said aristocratic, that resounded with me, because for some reason my image of Franz Beckenbauer is that he was middle class. I don't know if that's true or not.
No, I think it is.
I
don't think it's true at all. I think
exactly. But
I think his dad might have been a postal worker or something.
There you go. But he gave the.
But see, isn't that? I mean, we on the World Football Phone-In we did recently, one listener compared him to Bobby Moore, and there is a lot in that. When Bobby Moore meets the Queen to get the World Cup in '66. Who's the more regal of the two? You don't know, do you? and so what both of these, Moore and Beckenbauer, I think what they illustrate is the natural nobility of traditional working class values.
Isn't it amazing? But I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. younger listeners to the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast might be also thinking, what, 20, 30 years after the war is still playing a part in people's thinking on the football pitch, in terms of rivalry or otherwise. It's a different world, now, sad to say to some extent, you go to war and people say, well, let's keep the politics out of football or whatever it might be, that doesn't make, and arguably to a certain extent, it's shown by the now very friendly rivalry, I would say, between Argentina and England, despite the Falklands War, that football manages to stand above uh, those sorts of enmities of hostilities. At that time, I mentioned the Soviet Union. If this was USA against the Soviet Union, as it was in ice hockey or basketball in the Olympic Games, actually the Cold War was the dominant thoughts on most people's minds. This is USA versus Soviet Union. Even on the track, I remember in what happens in 1972 at the Munich Olympic Games is that Valery Bortsov, this Russian runner who will never ever win another gold medal. I think he might have won. He might have won the world athletics championships as well. But this is his moment because the two or three American runners who were African American runners who were faster than him, they understood the timing. It was supposed to be the final or whatever was supposed to be run at 50. It might have been before the final, actually. I think it might have been.
Is that right? They
Yeah,
messed up. They didn't turn
yeah,
up.
yeah, because it was like 1,500 hours and they thought that was 5 o'clock or something like
Yeah,
that.
I
Yeah.
do that all the time. It's tough, that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
No,
If you haven't
see,
been in the army, yeah.
yeah, you got to take 2 hours off, mate. Yeah, I do that one all the
Yeah.
time.
Oh mate, it's an easy mistake to make, but that is basically because he won as I recall, and I'm remembering this from my 12-year-old memory. As I recall, he won that 100 meters final in something like 10.2 seconds, whereas the Americans had notched 9.9 at this point, and they
Right.
weren't in the final.
Uh-huh.
But immediately people, jumped on oh yeah, this is the Soviet Union USA rivalry. And then of course it came back again was it 76 when the Olympic Games was in the Soviet Union, or was it 1980? It was 76, was it? 76?
80 was Moscow.
80 in Moscow. And then there was the boycott by the Americans. And
Yeah,
again,
I'm
that's
thinking of Germany, Soviet Union, obviously, and I think rightly so. We see the Red Army as heroes. I mean, the amount of casualties that that's where the main front of the Second World War was, wasn't it? The Eastern Front with the Germans and the Soviet Union, and the casualties that the Soviet Union took are just horrendous. And they did exactly revenge. There was a lot of raping going on when the Red Army invaded Germany and put an end to the war. So I can really imagine there was some little bit of needle in this
but
game.
I think this game is more about the Cold War, isn't it? I would have thought
Yeah,
this
perhaps,
game is not about the Second World War. This game is about West Germany saying, you've got half of our land, but we're going to
yeah.
win this game or whatever it might be. Um,
But I'm
okay,
sure that some maybe of the mothers on
yeah,
both sides
possibly, possibly.
had dreadful memories of what the male predecessors from the other country had done to them. Isn't it so much better that these two countries can come and meet and dispute on a football field than do this through the horrors of warfare?
The When we talk about Beckenbauer, though, I feel that when we focus on what he achieved on the field, we're only talking about half the man here. If that, because he goes
But
on
it's
to
the better
become.
half, I think, because
You
there's
reckon?
this. Yeah, well, there's. I don't think he was a great coach. Uh,
But I
I
wasn't
mean,
thinking about him as a coach, but
yeah, I'm
I'm
not even
thinking
sure
about,
about. I mean, there's a few scandals.
are there? Okay, I
Yeah,
didn't know
in
that.
as an admin, there's. I mean, he got a FIFA ban
Oh,
from
oh.
football activities for a while. So I think the best. There's no doubt about it. The best of Beckenbauer was was on the field. In terms of things that he might have done off the field, again, you have to remember the circumstances in which he was raised, and how precarious, because you don't lose that ever, ever. Growing up amid rubble, you don't lose. So I'll cut him a bit of slack, I think.
Fair enough, and that's very generous of you. Oh, you prefer the word magnanimous, don't you?
I do, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Do you know how to
It's now
pronounce it?
it's magnanimous. It's now yeah. I always get it mixed up with that wrestler Mick McManus.
Oh yes,
I'm sure he's very magnanimous himself.
very good. You thought about this overnight, haven't you? And let's do as we always do. Have a look at
Oh,
uh,
let's.
the musical soundtrack of the time. Remember, this is 1972, so I'm pretty much in my element here
I'm
because,
sure you are.
well, 1972 would probably be the optimum point at which I realized there was a greater thing in
Yeah.
life than playing Knockdown Ginger, which was pop charts.
Well, it's either option number one, setting
Yeah,
fire to the school, or
yeah,
option
yeah.
number two, the pop charts. Should we focus on option number two, you delinquent?
Yeah, but only after mentioning that you can read all about it in Effries. Effries,
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah.
Effries, by Radio Dotun. But at number one is a tune that we can all resonate with. It's arguably not Don McLean's biggest number one song, Don McLean being an American folk singer or folk rock singer, if you like, but he went more the acoustic way than the other way. It wasn't his biggest number one tune, but I think it's the better of the two, the other one being American Pie.
Yeah, and there were loads of these singer-songwriters around at the time, weren't there? It's one of the things that characterizes, I think, the early 70s explosion of Tim Hardin, an absolute great one. McLean, there's such wisdom that he brings to his songs, I think.
Oh,
It,
100%.
it's the quality of that makes him stand out, the wisdom of the songs.
You have to give a big shout out to Bob Dylan for allowing these or breaking the barrier to folk singers, singer-songwriters becoming pop stars. But then if you give a big shout out to Bob Dylan, you got to give a big shout out to Honey Leadbelly Ledbetter. If you want to talk about somebody who popularized folk tunes, singer-songwriters, well, it probably starts, if not with him, but he is certainly a linchpin post-war. Vincent by Don McLean, it could have been a Bob Dylan song. It could have been a Joni Mitchell song. It could have been so many, different people singing it because it is within a genre. But none of them had thought, let us do a tune about this very challenged artist, Vincent van Gogh.
There's a vulnerability
And
in the voice that makes a song.
there's huge, and crucially, it starts off where you don't expect it to start off. Because when you hear the track, or you hear that there's a track called Vincent, you're not thinking of Vincent van Gogh. And even if you are, you're not thinking of starting it by saying Starry, Starry Night. It clearly fits in with the context and the chord progression and everything like that. But the repetition of Starry, Starry Night has something poetic about it, which immediately takes you into the art, as it were, because art is poetry and poetry is art. But I think there will never be another greater tribute to an artist than this tribute to Vincent van Gogh. It makes you cry. It makes you so sad sometimes. It could almost be a Christmas song because when it starts Starry, Starry Night, it is that kind of like, okay, this is not going to necessarily end well, but this is the time for celebration, if you like, of a Starry, Starry Night. I think it's an amazing track. It is at number one, at this time in 1972. It was in the charts for 7 weeks, and I think this is the highlight. If I was Don McLean, this would be my epitaph rather than a great tune, American Pie, which is more complex, obviously, about the death of, in particular, Buddy Holly, but arguably Buddy Holly, the big boss.
Interesting that you mentioned Buddy Holly, because I think there's a huge rediscover the 50s feel going through this charts. And you see this with, say, Michael Jackson doing Rockin' Robin, which is at number 3, but also the whole glam rock thing. A lot of that is rediscover the 50s. I mean, even like the name of Gary Glitter's first hit, which is in the top 10, Rock and Roll. And there's one record that kind of leaps out to me. It's not, I don't think it's particularly good, but I think it's interesting. And that's The Move, Californian Man. Now, that's their last single. And it's a rock and roll pastiche. And The Move at this point are just 3 people. Roy Wood, Jeff Lynne, and the drummer Bev Bevan. And they're just about to go two different ways. Jeff and Bev are going to go with the ELO. What's Roy Wood going to do? He's going
to go rock and roll.
Exactly. He's the glam rock thing, but very, very much 50s. And so I suppose that this is people making this music who have memories of the 50s as kids, and are now kind of recreating that. There's a lot of glam rock, even the Sweet and so on, who are in there with little Willy Willy Wong. There's a real 50s retro thing about it.
You know, you have captured this so amazingly, and you probably don't realize this is the point where I become a teddy boy.
That was going to be my next question. If this was a bridge.
Yeah, this was. Because how would I, as a 12-year-old in 1972, have even understood anything about 50s rock and roll? I didn't know what teddy boys were before that. I barely heard of the likes of Elvis Presley. Remember, we're a different generation. At this point, most of us are listening to Prince Buster, doing One Step
Just quickly
Beyond.
on Elvis. He's in the charts as well.
Of course he is.
Surely you're not going to defend an American trilogy. Surely you don't wish you'd been in Dixie. Tell me that you can't defend Elvis on this one.
Do you know what? When I discovered this is all mixed up, rock and roll, James Dean, and rebellion, all in one go. Remember, in those days, we only had little dictionaries at home. At school, you had bigger dictionaries, but every time you looked at the word rebel, which I knew I wanted to be a rebel, even though I didn't know what it meant. I knew for some reason James Dean was in a film called Rebel Without a Cause. That sounds just like me. Whenever you looked at a dictionary and it had the word rebel, they always referred to the rebellion of the South. In the American Civil War.
Wow.
So they didn't have any nuance.
Wow, yeah, Johnny Reb, yes.
Yeah,
right.
I looked at all the dictionaries, Tim, and all I could see was a rebel was the losing side in the American Civil War.
Wow.
Yeah, so for a moment, 12-year-old, all I want to do is, say the South will rise again. And I'll get back to American Trilogy in a moment. That top 10, though, answers the point that you made. It reflects the point you made. Because at number 2, Take Me Back Home by Slade, which is a sort of a English, quintessentially English. So Slade haven't hit their stride yet. This is just the beginning of them dominating the entire pop scene, like the Beatles.
Them and T-Rex.
Yeah, but T-Rex weren't bigger than Slade at the time. They were never bigger than Sam. Coming on to T-Rex as well. They were never bigger than Slade. By the time Slade had Come On, Feel the Noise and all those tunes, all the kids in the school playground were singing that or had that as a resonance.
And all the teachers were moaning about the fact they spelt the things wrong.
They couldn't spell. Yeah, the headmasters and teachers, they weren't happy about that at all. They deliberately spelled. But even here, Ohm is apostrophe O-M-E.
And back has no C. Take me back home.
Yep. Yeah, thank you very much. So that was a kind of a English, maybe a Brummie or Midlands Black Country interpretation of rock and roll from the 50s. T-Rex, Metal Guru, the whole of T-Rex was a reflection back to the 1950s of the music of the 1950s, but updated, giving it a
Mm,
little bit more energy, giving it a little bit more bass because the technology was now much stronger to, have a deeper sound.
that's
So
right.
for
But
me,
he found this formula of like Bo Diddley riffs, didn't he?
he did.
Bolan,
That's exactly it.
who'd been a hippie,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
you know when he breaks through and it has all that, but it's kind of stripped down, quick phrases. Metal
yeah.
Guru, is it
Is it
you?
you? And silly phrases as well, which is kind
Yes,
of rock and
but they
roll
always
thing.
little silly phrases that always rhymed
Yeah, yeah, of course.
over these kind of pumped out, souped up Bo Diddley riffs.
Yeah, much, much heavier than Bo Diddley
Yeah,
because, first thing I noticed
technology.
about T Rex, the first thing I noticed about him, or Mark Bolan and T Rex, first thing I noticed about them was that this is rock and roll. This is like the music, because Rockin' Robin was the one that introduced me to rock and roll. At number
Mm,
three, I got it in. I heard it on the TV, obviously. And by this point, the Jacksons cartoon was the equivalent of the Osmonds cartoon, and what much better than that as well, because they had better music, better singing, etc. And I'd heard Rockin' Robin probably on a cartoon first, the cartoon show, and it was going up the charts, and I couldn't afford it like most people until it was going down the charts, where the price of a record suddenly was halved, if not quartered. And they claimed that they were all jukebox records that they were selling at a cut price, but I don't believe that because you could find loads of copies, and there weren't that many jukeboxes by this time. I can assure you, there were quite a few, but not that many. So Rockin' Robin was the tune that allowed me to the gateway for me to discover, or because Rockin' Robin was by a guy called Bobby Day. So eventually you're trying, where can I get this Bobby Day track? Because you're not hearing it on radio.
yeah.
It's not like now that you'll hear classics radios stations playing tunes from the 50s or whatever. And eventually, when I heard it, maybe by chance, probably Emperor Roscoe, he used to play some rock and roll, possibly Wolfman Jack, because at this point, the legendary Wolfman Jack, who you can see in the amazing film American Graffiti, briefly, you can see him there, but he's a
Mm,
legend. He's a legend, but he's playing on American Forces Network radio at this time. People won't know about it, but it was the only way to hear, it was the only overseas American station that we could pick up that spoke our language because you could pick up
yeah.
stuff in Luxembourg or
I
France or
remember kind of changing the dial.
exactly, exactly. And then you get to American Forces Radio, and there's this guy called
And then
Wolfman
you
Jack.
get someone talking about not rock and roll, but rock and roll,
Well,
rock and roll.
not only rock and roll. Rock and roll will live forever. Hey, hey,
Mm,
rock and roll. This is this is Wolfman Jack. The Wolfman's in the house. This is Bobby Day, Rock and Robin. And that was what American forces were listening to in Germany. So I listened to that and probably heard Bobby Day along the way, and then just kept doing the research. And it was difficult to do the research. Otherwise, I'd have got all A stars at O level and everything like that because I spent a lot of time doing the flipping research. Too much. If it had been today with the internet, honestly, I'd have concentrated on my work, but I had to
You'd
spend
never
time.
burn down a school, would you? Your whole
No,
life would have been
no,
different.
yeah, this is very true. But hey, sliding doors, you go one way, I'll go the other. And then, of course, at number five, you've got The Drifters, which is a genuine uh, doo-wop book, doo-wop group or harmony group from the 1950s, revisiting some of their classic songs. Here,
Mm-hmm.
Saturday Night at the Movies, At the Club at number five. Yeah, the man who will cannot be named now, the certain Gary Glitter, who has long, of course, been what do they call it, cancelled. But Rock and Roll Parts One and Two, I won't lie, Rock and Roll Part One was the instrumental Trevor Horn. I'm sure he doesn't talk about this anymore because of that connection, but Trevor Horn has put it together, and it was again very much. This is very much like Wizard that Roy Wood from the Move was
Mm,
going to develop.
yeah.
Big sound, loads of horns, big horns, because rock and roll always had a saxophone. if you listen to early Bill Haley, you got
Yeah.
Rudy Pompili on the saxophone, quite a few of the Elvis Presley, but they would have like one tenor sax and that was it. Here they were having tenor saxes, baritone saxes, big saxes, huge
It's
things.
people like Chuck Berry who bring the guitar out front, but it hadn't really
Yes.
been.
Well, Chuck Berry famously didn't like to spend money on backing musicians.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, when he
Yeah.
toured Britain, he
It's all
toured
economics.
solo, but then he had a backing band in Britain, and he said, "Look, just rehearse that one tune, and basically all the tunes are like that, but I might change key." That's what he did. No,
Yeah.
genuinely. So when you booked Chuck Berry, you thought you were having what an 11-piece American band. No, you're getting one bloke with his guitar going by train from London to Glasgow for a gig and make sure that the backing band in Glasgow has learnt the tune. Otherwise, he's going to get vexed and
Mm.
just go straight into it. He was a
Uh-huh.
businessman. Why
Yeah.
not? What?
Well, you had
What?
to be. You had to be to survive. Have you seen number 12,
Yep.
Hurricane Smith?
Mm?
Oh, baby, what would you say? Do you know who he was?
No, I have
It's
no
unbelievable. It's
clue.
unbelievable,
It's
this
a
story.
great track.
He's Norman Smith, who John Lennon christened Normal Smith. He was the recording
Oh,
engineer for the
no
Beatles
way.
and for Pink Floyd. And he's getting on for 50 and he thinks, fuck this, I'm going to make some music. So yeah, he has a few hit songs. It's an unbelievable story. And obviously he can't call himself Norman Smith. So he thinks, all right, Hurricane, I'll be Hurricane,
Yeah, always works.
So
Hurricane always works, mate.
this North Londoner, who's middle-aged North Londoner, suddenly becomes a pop star after spending all this time behind the controls. And it's an unbelievable story.
Yeah.
Lindisfarne with Lady Eleanor
Yes.
is it's a lovely chorus. I find the verses, come on, get on with it. But I find them fascinating because it's a kind of genuine northeast England take on American West Coast music with those
Yeah. Yeah.
harmonies. You can
Yeah.
hear like America
Yeah.
Horse with No Name and stuff
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
harmonies that they
Yeah.
do. And the one I really want to get to you on about, it's in the charts for the first week at number 49.
Yeah.
Starman, David Bowie.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
It's
mean, it's
just
his
come
big
to the
breakthrough,
charts.
isn't it? I mean, he's
Yeah.
had Space Oddity, but it's a one-off novelty. And then what am I going to do now? And Starman is he's got this character, and again, it's harking back to 50s rock and roll in the sense of he's created this character, Ziggy Stardust, who is
Yeah.
this rock and roll star.
Mm.
And I vaguely remember seeing this. It did nothing for me, but for many people, him being on Top of the Pops for the first time doing this song
Yeah.
is one of those huge, iconic, life-changing moments. Did it
Yeah.
cut through for you?
No, not at the time. Not until he did Gene Genie, which is more Bo Diddley riff rock and roll for me.
Yeah.
That was the point where, I mean, you
Or
couldn't have.
Rebel. You get your favorite word in there twice in the
Yeah,
title.
this is true. This is true. That wasn't as much 50s as Gene Genie. But like I've said to you before, David Bowie, as I recall, and you couldn't avoid him as a 12-year-old at this time. You couldn't avoid him. You knew that this person was idiosyncratic at the very least. You just had to look at the album covers, let alone hear the tunes. Um, and I seem to be more fascinated at this point by the fact that one of his eyes was blue and the other one was brown. That seemed to be the thing that my 12-year-old mind was more interested in than the music. But as you know, my first love was Jane Grayson, and she was a David Bowie fan. And when I knocked on her door one day, and no, it wasn't David Bowie she was singing at that time, but she was a David Bowie fan. But when I knocked on her door, she was singing 20th Century Boy, I want to be your toy. She opened the door and my heart melted, obviously. But that aside, at this point, it was the clever kids in school who got the David Bowie thing. It was the
Right.
clever kids. The rest of us numpties who were spending most of our lunch times boxing the living daylights out of each other. Um, we hadn't quite got to that
Mm-hmm.
level yet. We were still ruining the fact that there was some some kid from the USA, from Salt Lake City, Utah, waving the flag for some religion called the Mormons that we'd never ever heard
Did
of.
you? I didn't know they were Mormons then. And Donnie's in the charts with Puppy Love, isn't he? But
Yeah,
my only
yeah.
knowledge, my knowledge of that came later.
Well, it was one of those
And
things that
Puppy Love is again, it's a late 50s croon.
it is. It is. Yeah, they were turning him to a young crooner, a teenage crooner, because in the 50s, it was older people, sometimes in their 30s singing, well, they called it puppy love. Oh, I guess they'll never know how the young hearts. Whereas Donny Osmond, every single girl that you knew of your age, I mean, we probably hadn't discovered girls at this point. I discovered Jane Grayson, but it wasn't a real crush. It wasn't like let's go to the back row of the cinemas and have a snog. I'll take you out for a Wimpy and a Knickerbocker
Saturday night at
Glorious.
the movies.
Yeah, it was, but it never happened for me.
Uh-huh.
For those kids, it happened to. I was so envious of them. But Donny Osmond was sitting there. Actually, when the Osmonds came to Osmonds, David Cassidy, less so the Jackson, only slightly less so because they were Michael Jackson hadn't come forward as a solo lead in the Jackson Five as prominently as Donny Osmond had from the Osmonds. Basically, we weren't bothered about the rest of the Osmonds until Jay Osmond came out with Crazy Horses. Until then, the rest of the Osmonds could go and take a running jump. It was only Donny that people were interested in. When people paid tickets, when the Osmonds came over, it must have been more chaotic than the Beatles flying into America in 1964 to take Merseyside there, and when they couldn't get out of the airplane because the whole airfield was filled with. I do remember. Maybe I'm imagining this, but the Osmonds landing at Heathrow Airport and not being able to get off their plane either because there were so many in every sort of inch of Heathrow's arrival hall. Certainly was just screaming girls, and it was TV news. It was like if it wasn't the main headline in the news, it was like second lead or third lead.
That
And
is
Puppy
love and
Love was the one.
sacrifice, isn't it? That's a real schlep out on the dilly line, that one.
That's what they did. That's what they did. They bunked off school. Girls, I mean, I went to a boys' school, so I didn't notice the empty chairs in school, but everybody else, there was a girls' school just, around the corner from where we are. I mean, literally around the corner, virtually across the road from where we were at school. And I imagine half of their, certainly 12 and 13, second year, first, second, third year of the senior school was half empty when the Osmonds came. Yeah, so that was a bane of our lives, the Osmonds, and then it became years later. It became the Bay City Rollers. I remember walking down Lordship Lane because I grew up on the farm, as it were, Broadwater Farm, and just across the road from the farm, walking down Lordship Lane, and these girls coming towards me, all dressed in sort of tartan trim, and I kind of like had one of these look at these guys. They must have seen me coming up and ridiculous. And so they had somehow worked out as they passed me, they went, B-A-Y, B-A-Y, C-I-T-Y, rollers. That was
Rollers rule okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Apparently.
Exactly, apparently so. No, funny enough, after the top 10 is when this chart becomes really interesting. There are so many different things going
I
on.
think I love him, but we got to slag off Macca at 9.
Yeah, it's not, well, yeah, it doesn't
Well,
fit.
Mary had a little lamb.
Yeah, I know,
It's all very well. You got little
Yeah,
kids
I
and you want to
know.
make music for them.
Yeah.
You don't have to release it to the general public. You can just play it for them at home.
But hey, I'm going to allow him that one because he'd done so much before that, which we can't criticize. So I'm going to allow him that one. You'd have to ask him. It's like asking David Bowie, what was all that? What was it that he did? That ridiculous tune that he did? Do you know the one where he dressed up like a clown or whatever it was? What was it? Do you remember David Bowie? What was it? It'll come to me in a moment or two, and you'll see. Because I can almost sing it now. You know the one that he did.
I remember him as a clown with Ashes to Ashes.
Yeah, no, before Ashes to Ashes. What did he do? I'll come
He
to me
did
in a
duet. He
second.
did Christmas duets with Bing Crosby, but that's probably not what you're referring to.
Yeah, no, no, no. What was it? It was a novelty track, wasn't it? It was a kind of a
The
novelty
Laughing
track.
Gnome.
That's the one. That's the one. Let's get back to that. Yeah. So this is Macca's equivalent of the laughing gnome, I think. You'd have to ask David Bowie what, and you can't because he's no longer with us. What all that laughing gnome was all
Well, he
about.
was trying to do Anthony Newley. That's what he was trying to do at the
Yeah,
time, I think.
well, I'm sure Macca would have a similar excuse. He shouldn't have done it. Roberta Flack, though, at number 17, first time ever I saw your face. Not an original by her, but she shows how you can take a song from a folk singer, singer-songwriter, and turn it into an absolute gem of a track that I think her version will last forever. It's very haunting. It's really haunting.
Mm.
And it sends shivers down my back every time. Um, and it will live forever. It will live forever. Then you might have a beef with Gilbert O'Sullivan, ooh wackadoo wackaday. He's not quite in his get down. You're a bad dog, baby, but I don't want you around. He's not
Good
quite there yet.
songwriter.
Yeah, 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 decent pub. There is a feel of like the pub singer, which is, Chaz and Dave, you'll know, pub singers. It seems to be a dead art now. You don't really get them because pubs, don't allow music as much as they used
And
to.
obviously, the contrast then is with the one who's exactly behind him, Elton John, who
Well, yeah,
is a stadium pianist,
but
isn't he?
started out as a pub singer, I would have
Yeah,
thought.
yeah.
Yeah,
But I think the stadium entirely shapes his career. I
yeah,
would have preferred him massively because I think he's talented. I would have massively preferred him had he stayed what he intended to be in the
yeah. It
'60s.
doesn't work that way, mate.
No, it
Because if he
doesn't. No,
stayed,
there's a
if he stayed as what he was in the
everything that he
'60s,
does. Yeah,
yeah,
but you couldn't do stadiums in the '60s. The technology
well,
just wasn't there for it. But
yeah,
by the '70s, it is, and I think it shapes everything. It certainly shapes the clothes because it's these ridiculous clothes to be visible inside a stadium. But
yeah.
also, I think the style of music
I
is
agree. I agree with the
is
style of music.
for the stadium. I think it changes it changes the whole thing.
I don't think we realised it when Rocket Man came out. It got to number two, by the way. At the moment, it's at number 19, going down with a bullet, if you like. But if you think about the orchestration of Rocket Man, it's a big tune. It is. It's not what you would call, not by any means, what you would call a power tune, but it has elements of that in it. You can hear the build up to it, and as we now know, it's probably the one tune for Elton John's that resonates more than anything because it's been dragged out in a political context by the likes of Donald Trump, not too far in the distance with regard to Kim Jong-un of North Korea being a rocket man, etc. But it's the one, and they use it in so many TV adverts and all that kind of stuff. But it
I'm
has
not a fan, but
elements.
there's one that I just can't get in my head the last couple of days, which is Benny and the Jets.
Yeah, no, yeah,
No, I
I'm
love
not
it. I
bothered
love it,
about
and
that. Did you? I'm not bothered about
it
that.
got on
Yeah,
Soul Train.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
on
yeah, yeah,
Soul Train
yeah,
because he's got a
yeah,
groove.
yeah.
And when they recorded it, they didn't think anything of it at all, and it was a smash. And I love it. I just
Mm.
can't get it out of my head. Maybe it's because it mentions mohair suit in the lyrics. I don't know, but
Well, yeah, I think that was
it
it. I
hits my
was thinking,
spot.
mate, I was a suede head for a minute, so don't worry about the mohair suit, two-tone mohair if you don't mind. But he doesn't quite go there. Amazing Grace at number 23 by the pipes and drums and the military band of the Royal Scots
Please no,
Dragoon Guard.
please no. I
No, I'll
hated
tell
it.
you, I'll tell you why you may hate it. This got to number one, and I think it says something about Britain at the time,
Yeah.
that we are looking for something. 1972 wasn't the best time. It gets worse. By 1974, of course, there's industrial strife, and Britain is bleak. It's bleak by 1974, but this is the run up to it. And it's almost as if, Amazing Grace. Now, in retrospect, I don't think anybody thought so at the time. Well, I know nobody thought so at the time. In retrospect, this is almost the beginning of us saying, look, somebody please save us from what's coming. Because it's a false dawn, the sort of glam rock business. Glam rock is almost like an invention of a political party that decided, well, let's cheer people up because we can't, because
Yeah, let's just have a
they're not
giggle.
earning. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And for the younger people, it made you sort of look over the fact that the things weren't as great as they were. That none of us could afford a Riley chopper unless Shoot magazine was giving away 50. Every single kids magazine was giving away Riley choppers. That gives you an idea of what we were thinking about. Not even a decent bike, but they still exist in Jamaica. Some knackered old 50-year-old Riley choppers, often ridden by dreadlocks with really, 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 really long hair. I think what's interesting as well is last time we spoke, we were paying a tribute to Mario Zagallo here on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. Guess what was in the charts that's still in the charts now? Not still in, exactly. Nut Rocker. And I did
Nut
say
rocker.
number two. That was at number two in 1962. And I did say to you when we were talking about it, what do you think about that? Isn't that an interesting sort of a reinvention of a classic or classical music tune from whenever? I don't know if it's Beethoven or one of those blokes. I can't tell you which is which. But once you do the da 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 da, you realise what B Bumble and the Stingers have done.
And
And
it's entirely appropriate because it's in the charts when we did Zagallo. And Zagallo working back as a left winger to pack the midfield then has a huge influence on Beckenbauer, who thinks, well, if there's less space in the midfield, I'm going to start the moves from deeper. So I love the fact that there's a nut rocker connection between the tribute that we did to Zagallo and the tribute that we do to the great Kaiser Franz Beckenbauer.
yeah, and I thought you'd go for the Revolution because it's a revolutionary take on a classical tune as well. You could do it by that. Lots of great tunes in the charts, but I think that one rounds this conversation up very neatly. Sylvia's mother says Sylvia's busy, and the operator says, "Oh, is that the time?" You need another 5 cents more to carry on talking on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. I'm afraid we got to go. We got to go. Tim,
Yeah, I
thank
don't know what Sylvia's mother was saying, but I have an idea what Jane Grayson's brother was saying. Clear off.